3 heavy knocks landed on the cabin door like a judge's gavel, measured and grim, each one separated by a breath that sounded like the storm itself pausing to listen. Celeste Warren straightened from the hearth, a coal shovel in one hand and the shape of solitude in her shoulders. 40 winters had taught her the mountain's moods and the town's cruelty. They had also taught her that after dark in a blizzard, no visitor meant peace and every visitor meant trouble. The wind pressed its face against the seams, snarling through the chinks as if it wanted in. Snow sifted out of the rafters with each shudder of the logs. Celeste's gaze slid to the rifle on the wall, a habit, not a threat, then to the iron latch. The knocks came again, quicker, the pattern turning from demand to plea. She hesitated. Caution had kept her alive. Compassion had kept others alive. Both lived under her ribs and rarely agreed. She crossed the floor, boots whispering on old pine. Frost fogged the small window to a milky blur, but a silhouette moved in it, a tall figure, shoulders heaped with white, hat brim bowed under the weather. The shape rocked, caught itself, rocked again. A glove struck the door one last time and fell. Between gusts, a hoarse voice threaded the crack. Shelter. Celeste threw the latch. The storm shoved back like an angry bull, flinging cold into the room, and a man stumbled across her threshold, heavy as wet timber. He collapsed to the boards, the smell of iron and ice clinging to him. Celeste shouldered the door shut and dropped the bar, then dragged him toward the fire, one arm under his coat, the other bracing his weight. He was all angles and exhaustion, the kind of tired that sleep has to dig for. Blankets went over him in layers. Heat lifted from the long coat as the heat bit. Beads of thaw ticked onto the hearthstone. His gloves were frozen to his fingers. She worked them loose, breath steady, jaw set. The skin beneath was purpled and stiff, pain climbing back into it as the cold retreated. He hissed, then shaped a wry line with cracked lips. "Don't fuss," he muttered, voice roughened by miles. "Cold cuts worse than charity." "It cuts worse when pride keeps it in," Celeste said, and set his hands near the flames, close enough for warmth, not close enough for harm. Heat traveled slow like news to a suspicious town. He watched the fire until his eyes could hold something other than survival. When he finally looked up, they were a smoke blue she had no word for, clear in a way that made the room feel larger. "Jesse Callahan," he said, "I owe you my hide." "Celeste Warren," she answered, as if he hadn't already stepped into her name by choosing this door. The valley had put other words around it, witch, odd, unmarriageable, but none of those were true here. In the cabin, her name fit. He worked a soaked leather satchel off his shoulder, fingers clumsy. The buckles parted. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, edges tight, purpose plain. He untied it on the table with the care of a man who knew paper could set a life on a new road or off a cliff. Wax seals glowed red in the firelight. Official ribbons lay like coiled creek water. Celeste didn't move closer. She had learned that sometimes the way to keep her balance was to make the world come to her. Jesse placed a letter nearest the light and slid it across. The script was precise, a woman's hand, austere and beautiful. "From a law office out of San Francisco," he said, "not performing, just stating. I was hired to find Celeste Warren of this mountain, to tell her she's heir to land and investments totaling $60,000. The number hung in the air with the steam from his coat, unbelievable and solid at once. Celeste had never seen more than $50 together, unless it belonged to a man across a counter who charged her double for flour. $60,000 was not a sum, it was a country. She kept her face quiet, though a startled laugh scratched at her throat. "A mistake," she said, and the words sounded careful, like testing ice. "My people are gone." "Not all," Jesse said. He tapped the letter. Minerva Warren, a cousin stretched thin across the branches, passed last month, left her estate to you. He let a breath out, and with it the last of the storm seemed to leave his shoulders. One condition: marry within 6 months, otherwise the state swallows it whole. The room shrank a finger's width and then steadied. Marriage sat in the air like a draft she had always pretended not to feel. The town had used that word against her for years, keeping count of what she hadn't done as if that were sport. Virgin at 40 is how they said it when they wanted to wound and smile while wounding. She had learned to live as if the wound were a scar. She had learned to move without bleeding. Now the law itself threaded marriage onto her name like a hook. Celeste stepped to the table and touched the seal. It was cool and convincing. Her grandmother's old notebook lay on the shelf behind her, the one full of remedies that had saved children and made enemies. She knew the feel of truth on paper. This had it. "Why a cowboy?" she asked finally. "Why ride a blizzard to a stranger's door with a thing like this?" He gave a small shrug. "For hire and for right aren't always separate. I can read a trail, I can carry a message, and I don't mind weather that tries to change my mind." His gaze held hers without pity, without hunger. The simple fact of it, being seen without being sized, moved through her like the first warm current under river ice. Outside, the wind struck its last defiant chords. Inside, the fire put its bright hand on both their faces and made them belong to the same room. "Stay," Celeste said. The word was meant for the night, but it touched more than hours. "Until it eases." Jessie nodded, spent in the way that makes a man honest. He stretched near the hearth, long frame folding into rest. Celeste set the papers in a careful stack, her palm flat on them like a promise to open them again when her breath was steady. The cabin exhaled. The storm pressed its cheek to the window and watched. The town would get this story wrong in the morning, for now the mountain kept its own counsel, and a woman who had learned to live without witness stood in the doorway between winter and something else and decided, quietly, completely, on mercy.
Dawn opened pale and brittle, the kind of morning that looks clean only because the cold had scoured every sound away. Frost ringed the window where Celeste Warren stood with the papers spread before her like a map to a country she had never thought would invite her in. The seals held their composure under the light, red and wax-sure. Her name, Celeste Warren, appeared in a script neat as a ruler, as if the hand that wrote it had believed in her without once meeting her eyes. Jesse Callahan woke with the cautious stretch of a man who knows his body will file a protest. Stiffness sketched itself across his shoulders and along the bandaged hands Celeste had saved from numbness. He propped himself on an elbow near the hearth and watched her. She didn't fuss with the papers. She regarded them, steady and unblinking, as a woman used to reading weather for its real intent. "Coffee?" he asked, voice still rough with sleep. "If you can lift the kettle without cursing," she said, not unkind, and the corner of his mouth thought about a smile. They drank with the patient's hot cup's demand. Then he spoke, placing words in the air as if setting stones in a creek. He named the office in San Francisco. He named Minerva Warren, a cousin distant as a rumor turned true. He named the total, $60,000, and properties that wore numbers the way mountains wear snow. He named the condition, low and factual: marriage within 6 months, or the estate gone to the state. Celeste listened without flinching, even when the talk turned around that word the town had jabbed into her for years. Virgin at 40, they had said, some with pity, most with sport. She had outlasted the sting by calling her solitude a choice, because sometimes survival, when carried long enough, can be mistaken for preference. Now the law tried to make a bargain of her life. She set her cup down and let her breath slow until it obeyed. "You could walk away from this," Jessie said, careful not to lean on the thought. "The money changes everything, and too much at once. Taking it is work. Refusing it is work. She regarded him over the rim of her cup, her expression the same evenness she offered strangers with fevers and neighbors with sharp tongues. "I could," she said, "but the dead thought of me at the end. I won't dishonor that by running before I've read every line." She read. He let her. Silence took up a chair at the table. Outside, the frozen morning let the wind rehearse its old grievances in the pines. Inside, the cabin held two kinds of heat, the fire's and the kind that comes from being looked at without judgment. Jesse tied his bandages tighter and rose. He cleaned the ashes and laid new logs with the efficient grace of a man who has learned the rhythm of shelter. Celeste watched him work, not as an inspection, but as the simple witnessing she had wanted all her life, to exist in company without being corrected for existing. By noon, news sprouted in the valley like weeds that thrive on thin soil. The first knock came brisk, then ingratiating. Tom Henley stood on the threshold with a bouquet that looked as if it regretted being involved. He had once doubled the price of flour when Celeste's choices were hunger or humiliation. He entered now like a gentleman in a play, hat off, words sweet. "Miss Warren, I come with sincere regard and a wish to square what you charged me last week," she asked. She didn't smile when she said it. The bouquet wilted faster than weather. He made a series of noises that cannot be written as words and left. The second caller arrived in a pressed coat with city polish and a wooden box lined in velvet. He set a silver ring on the table, where it collected light and nothing else. "My intentions are honorable," he assured the room, loud enough for the ring to hear. "For whom?" Celeste asked, voice level. He blinked, considered, and chose not to answer the real question. She closed the box and pushed it back. "I'm not a ledger entry to correct your deficits."
Snow softened into a wet gloss by afternoon, and the mountain exhaled the ache of the blizzard in slow, white breaths from the pines. Celeste Warren had just pegged a braid of time to the rafters when a frantic hammering rattled the cabin door, 2 short bursts and a broken gasp between. She opened to Mrs. Fletcher, cheeks raw, gloves crooked, eyes bright with terror. "Please," the woman panted, clutching a dark green bottle to her chest as if it might bite. "Timothy, he's burning and fading both. Dr. Weatherby gave this. He said it cures fevers. The more we give, the weaker he gets." Celeste took the bottle and lifted it to the light. Thick liquid sloshed, slow as regret. A metallic tang licked the air. Her mouth thinned. "Jesse," she said, already shrugging into her shawl, "bring the satchel." He was up before the last word, bandaged hands sure around the strap. They fell into the wind together. Mrs. Fletcher stumbling ahead, the path down the mountain sliding into mud where the snow had begun to lose its grip. Timothy lay in a small back room that smelled of boiled sheets and fear. Heat slicked his skin. A scatter of red pinpoints stippled his chest and arms. His breath was shallow, thin threads fraying at the ends. Celeste set the bottle on the table and uncorked it. The metallic stink hit hard, like pennies left too long on the tongue. She didn't flinch. "No more of this," she said, voice low and even. "Bring clean water, many cups." Mrs. Fletcher flew, gratitude and terror wrestling in her steps. Jesse stood at the foot of the bed, presence steady as a fence post. He watched without hurry and without helplessness while Celeste laid a cool palm across the boy's brow and took his pulse with 2 fingers that had found life through worse odds. She crushed charcoal and slippery elm and a pinch of rue in a bowl, added water, stirred until darkened. "This will turn the wrong thing out," she told the child, her voice pitched to reach a consciousness floating somewhere near the ceiling. "You work with me." The first spoonful brought a spasm. Jessie slid a basin under the boy's chin with the reflex of a man who has steadied 1,000 unsteady things. The poison came up in a rush, ugly and green. Mrs. Fletcher wept into her hands. Mr. Fletcher stared at the bottle like a snake he'd invited into his crib. Celeste wiped the boy's mouth and gave a second draught, gentler, to soothe the ravaged lining of his stomach, a third to coax the heat down from its fever-shined perch. Time stretched into a taut string. Then, slowly as thaw, the boy's breathing deepened. The red pinpoints dulled. He slept as if the bed remembered how to hold him. "Mercury," Celeste said, at last, the word flat as iron. She dropped a drop of the green liquid on a copper coin from her satchel. Before their eyes the bright metal droozed, then pitted. "Mercury's cure carries poison." She did not look at the parents when she said it. Her gaze rested on the sleeping boy, as if naming the truth above him could keep it from being twisted. Jessie reached for the coin, studied the corrosion, and something older than trail work sharpened in his eyes. "I've seen court paper on this down in Texas. Old remedies over-strengthened, then sold dear. People on the edge pushed over it." He set the coin down like a piece on a board. "If it's more than one bottle, it's not a mistake." Celeste's mouth softened, but did not smile. "It isn't one. Mrs. Patterson's girl took from this same glass last week. I smelled it then. I wasn't sure. Now I am." She corked the bottle and handed it to Jessie. "We'll need more than a mother's word against a doctor's coat." They walked back through slush and blue shade, neither hurrying nor dawdling. At the door of the cabin, Jessie paused, scanned the drifted margin beneath the window, and frowned. 2 sets of boot prints had circled while they were gone, wide, patient steps that lingered where lamplight would throw silhouettes. He scuffed them out with a deliberate heel, and said only, "We're watched." Celeste's jaw lifted. Fear visited, registered, left with nothing in its pockets. Night sat early. Lamplight pooled on the table. Celeste opened her grandmother's leather notebook. The brown cracked through with years, edges softened by use, and paged to a hand-drawn skull and crossbones someone had doodled long ago in the margin beside a tidy paragraph. Children, fever, rash, vomiting, metallic taste. Suspect mercury, especially in green tonics. She tapped the line and slid the book toward Jessie. He read, not at once, and pulled the papers he had begun to arrange. Names, dates, prices, symptoms. 12 cases make a pattern. 3 make an argument. 2 make a warning. He dipped his pen, letters slow and square, evidence paced by patience. We start the count. They divided the work without speaking. She measured drops onto coins, watched brightness die, and recorded what death looked like on copper. He listed families, Fletcher, Patterson, Morrison, adding the costs they'd paid after the sickness, a pasture sold here, a pair of breeding cows there, a loan taken at terms that wouldn't bend. When ink dried, he blew gently across the page. When her eyes blurred, she closed them for the count of 10 and opened them again to the same tasks. Outside, the mountain's darkness held steady. Inside, 2 small flames, the lamp and their resolve, pushed it back far enough to work. By noon of the next day, the valley had sprouted rumors the way damp boards sprout fungus. Mrs. Patterson came white-faced with her Sarah, weak, flushed, bottle in hand. The routine repeated, as precise as liturgy. Purge, soothe, watch. Coin, drop, proof. Gratitude stammered. Blame bit at its leash. Celeste didn't accept either. She focused on the child's breath. "Let her sleep," she said when it steadied. "No more green." The church bell tolled Sunday into the valley like a command to convene, and they convened, they did. The council hall filled with coats and assumptions. Weatherby sat front with his ledger-sober air, the practiced kindness of a man who has been believed so long he cannot remember how he earned it. Celeste stood with her grandmother's book in her hands, Jessie at her shoulder, the green bottle and the ruined coins laid where lamplight could find them. She did not raise her voice. She simply told them what had happened in rooms that smelled of boiled sheets and fear, and she showed what green poison did to copper, and she pointed to words written years ago that matched the burns on a boy's tongue. Jesse set down his pages, names, dates, sales, and drew a line with his finger that anyone could follow. Murmurs rose, denial, defense, the creak of pride turning toward truth. Then Mrs. Fletcher, trembling but upright, set her hand on Timothy's head and said it plain, "My child lives because of her." Others found their courage and stood. In the surge and counter-surge of voices, Celeste did not chase anyone's approval. She held her ground as if the floor was a patch of mountain she had brought with her. She was the woman the valley had called strange, fat, too old, untouched. She was also the one who knew how to turn a poison out and a rumor into evidence. Eyes that had skimmed over her for decades learned in fits and starts to rest. When the hall emptied into cold air, the town's gaze felt different, not pretty, not fixed, just learning. Jessie's hand brushed her sleeve, a small touch anchored to a large promise. "They'll wiggle before they concede," he murmured. "Let them," she said. "I don't need their softness, I need their seeing." They climbed the path home in a dusk that tasted like iron and snowmelt. At the cabin, Celeste hung the green bottle on a nail above the table, a reminder and a warning. Jessie set the ledger stack beneath it. Mercy and Mercury stared at each other across the room, and between them stood two people who had decided that neither storm nor custom would decide the valley's fate unchallenged. The lamp burned steady. The mountain listened, and in the quiet that followed the crowd, the future began to write itself in careful letters, black on white, stubborn as truth.
March slipped its thawing fingers under the mountain snow and pried winter loose in slow inches. The cabin settled into a rhythm that did not ask permission from the town below. Each morning, smoke lifted from the chimney like a flag that declared a private country, Celeste Warren's country, where a black fat woman of 40 kept her own counsel, and a cowboy with smoke-blue eyes learned the difference between passing through and staying. He stayed. Jesse Callahan patched chinks with tow and paste. He chiseled a channel so meltwater would run away from the threshold instead of under it. He stacked firewood and cords that would make next January less mean. Celeste returned the cabin to itself after the storm, swept ash, oiled the table scarred by hard years, sorted jars of herbs by need instead of alphabet. Their movements interlaced without lesson or lecture. When his bandaged fingers faltered, she tied a fresh strip of muslin with the neatness of a woman who has bound more wounds than she has spoken hopes aloud. When her shoulders ached from hauling, his palm landed between them with a push that said rest, and a gentleness that said, "I see you." The valley learned, in its stubborn way, about Weatherby's ledger and the green bottle that ate copper like a lie eats trust. The council set a date for a trial with more paper than shouting. Until then, families brought their sick up the slope, not with trumpets, but with the hush of people crossing into ground where someone might actually help. Jessie did what she had always done. Purge what must be purged, soothe what must be soothed, speak the truth without flattering the listener. Only now, when gratitude slipped out, she did not sidestep it. She nodded and took it like bread, useful, not intoxicating. The papers with red seals stayed under a clean cloth on the table. $60,000, and the weight of it breathed in the room the way a banked fire breathes, quiet, hot, ready. The condition breathed too. Marry within 6 months. Not a rumor, not a taunt, law. It ticked at the edge of her days like a beetle in the wall. Some mornings Celeste could almost forget it. Some nights she could not. Suitors came less boldly after the council meeting scorched pride. They still came. A rancher who called her practical the way a man calls a horse sound. A clerk from town who assured her he did not mind her age or her size, insisting on not minding as if either were a sin he would magnanimously overlook. A trader from Denver with a contract already inked, offering terms that treated her like a business partner whose signature would be affixed under duress called urgency. Jesse never chased them off. He didn't have to. He occupied a chair in the corner, easy in his quiet, and the room recalculated itself around that quiet. Celeste answered each man as if she were haggling with weather. She named what was real, declined what wasn't, and closed the door with courtesy that did not apologize for being a door. Days lengthened. Celeste taught Jesse the local herbs by smell and shade. He taught her to read deeds and bonds until the language of ownership quit sneering at her and settled into meaning. On Sundays, they walked the ridge where wind combed the tall grass and the valley lay out like a map of old injuries and future corrections. He pointed toward a square of land by the creek. Clinic would breathe well there, he said, light on 2 sides. She looked, measured sun and flood in her head, and nodded. And a school beneath that cottonwood, so numbers belong to girls before anyone can steal them. The town did not rename her. It did sometimes greet her. Mrs. Fletcher pressed a pie into her hands one market day, cheeks flushing like the first peony of June. Timothy, taller now, waved from behind a stack of fence rails, his grin a living affidavit. Cordelia Hatcher still sharpened herself on gossip, but even her words sounded blunted, like a knife that had met bone too often to keep an edge. April brought a rain that wrote new lines into the road. Jesse mended the fence with the hunched focus of someone who prefers building to speeches. Celeste watched him through the wavering glass and felt something settle that never settled, the difference between being tolerated and being chosen. She did not hide from it. She folded it into herself, the way she folded dough, firmly, with an eye for what time and heat would make of it. At dusk, when the day's chores lay down and kept quiet, he sometimes set his old hat on her head with a seriousness that made it an honor and not a jest. "Suits you," he'd say. The brim threw her eyes into shade and made her smile brighter. At the table, they argued kindly about beans and beams, about floorboards and floor plans. He listened the way men in her life had not. He let her finish. He repeated her best idea back to her as if it were a jewel he wanted to be sure he had not dropped. The deadline walked closer in soft-soled shoes. Celeste marked its approach in small private ways. The number of times she opened Minerva's letter and touched the ink with 2 fingers. The count of mornings when anxiety woke before she did and waited at the side of the bed like an unhelpful relative. She prayed in a language that had no psalms, only facts. I want to do right. I want not to be owned by a condition or a town's memory. I want what is true to live longer than what is convenient. One evening, with rain threading the eaves and soup tensing to a simmer, she said without preface, "You've never asked." He looked up from the ledger he was reviewing, eyes unstartled. "Because I want you free to choose what you want, not what a clock wants." He closed the book and sat back. "If you say no, I'm still here. If you say yes, I'm still here. The money can buy lumber. It can't buy me." It was such an ordinary sentence that she had to sit down.
ordinary and huge, like roofs and bread, and names that don't hurt when spoken. She did not answer that night. She went out into the dusk, stood in the doorway the storm had once broken, and let the mountain look at her. The air was green and damp. The path shone like old pewter. Somewhere between their porch and the ridge, the choice that had stalked her came up beside her and matched her stride and finally quit haunting and started waiting. May warmed, June clarified, the 6th month drew itself up in bright certainty. On its last morning, the sky woke clean, with a hawk already drawing sentences no one could read and everyone could honor. Celeste stood on the porch with her hands empty and her heart full. Jesse came from the barn, the set of his shoulders unarmed. He slowed when he saw her face. "Let's grow old together," she said. No flourish, no bargain. He went still, like a bell in the breath before it rings. Then he covered her hands with his and answered what had already been answered by the life they had made in the quiet. In the valley, a clock struck an hour no one noticed. And the cabin, a woman who had carried other people's scorn like winter wood, put it down and kept only what warmed. The 6 months had done what storms do when met by the right house. They tested, revealed, and left a place stronger than they found it.
Summer took the valley in both hands and lifted. Light poured down the slope like grain from a split sack, and the meadow below the church dressed itself in daisies as if it had been waiting for this particular day. Celeste Warren stood at the porch rail of the cabin that had once held only her breath, smoothing the skirt she had sewn out of an old bolt of white cloth. The fabric honored her body instead of arguing with it. Seams lay true, and the hem skimmed strong calves that had climbed the mountain for 40 years. Jesse Callahan came from the barn in a clean shirt and that long trail coat, hair damp from the pump, eyes smoke blue and steady. He paused because the sight of her made even a man who had known what he wanted need to swallow once. They walked down together, not in parade, but in companionship, boots finding the path they had worn with ordinary days. The town waited in a loose circle around the preacher, men adjusting hats they suddenly remembered were dusty, women pressing palms to throats as if to hold puzzlement in place. Some children squirmed and then tried out the novelty of quiet. Those who had scorned Celeste stood with their faces arranged into new shapes, some softened, some stubborn, some simply uncertain in the way people look when the story they've told for years has been replaced by the truth happening in front of them. The preacher spoke brief, wise to the heat and the moment. Vows were plain. The ring was simple gold, not apology and not boast. When Jesse placed it on her finger, he did it as a craftsman sets a beam. Certain, careful, grateful for fit. When Celeste spoke her promise, she spoke it like someone who understood weather and wanted not to tame it, but to share shelter through it. Their kiss was not a performance. Silence held it as the better witness, and the meadow kept the secret of its sweetness the way grass keeps dew. After, on the church steps, they sat side by side and let the day pass around them. Timothy Fletcher sprinted circles, healthy legs testifying louder than any affidavit. Mrs. Fletcher pressed Celeste's hand and failed for once to find words. Tom Hanley removed his hat with the embarrassed sincerity of a man who has discovered his own meanness and would like to do less of it. Cordelia Hatcher maintained her spine, but lowered her chin, a concession measured in degrees. Jesse's palm covered Celeste's knee, a touch that read as ordinary until a person learned that ordinary is where love lives most of the time. Within the week, the last papers from San Francisco were signed, stamped, and returned. Minerva Warren's gift settled like rain into thirsty ground. They chose not to let the money shout. The old saloon at the corner, once loud with losing, became a clinic that smelled of sunlight on soap and of dried mint hung in the windows. Jesse and a crew of men with better hearts than hammers raised shelves and framed rooms. Celeste sorted jars and labeled them in the clear hand her grandmother had taught her. Name, use, measure. The green bottles that had once haunted sickbeds vanished from houses as if snapped up by a tide. Weatherby's conviction, when it came, was printed in a column small enough to miss, but the Ledger of the Valley kept it in larger letters. On market days, Celeste stood behind a counter where a mirror had once reflected a line of men measuring themselves by other men's eyes. Now it reflected mothers learning how to measure dosage, fathers learning that gratitude was not a debt but a practice. She treated bodies and taught them too, insisting on numbers for girls as if she were handing flint to people who had been rubbing sticks. "Count it yourself," she told a child, tapping the chalkboard gently, "so no one can count it wrong for you." Back on the mountain, the cabin learned the music of two. 2 mugs warming the same wash water. 2 coats on the peg by the door that had admitted a nearly frozen messenger and a new life. 2 pillows with honest dents. At supper time, Jesse sometimes came up behind Celeste at the stove and let his mouth graze the place where neck meets shoulder, because marriage had made the license for affection explicit but not compulsory. She sometimes grumbled at the interruption to keep her pride tidy, then tugged him closer to keep her joy honest. They slept like people who had nothing to prove in daylight. The town did not transform into kindness overnight. It seldom does. But cruelty lost its snap. Whispers thinned. When new gossip tried to graft itself onto old roots, it found poor purchase in soil that had been turned by facts and the stubbornness of care. A few still looked with measuring eyes. Most, eventually, simply looked. Autumn made itself known with a spare wind and the first yellow note in the cottonwoods. They used part of the inheritance to buy books and slate, set benches beneath that wide tree by the creek, and found a teacher who believed that questions are not impertinence, but hunger. The school bell's small, sincere sound traveled up the slope to the cabin and rang in Celeste's ribs as an echo of a particular knock that had once changed everything. Jesse built a footbridge so children could cross when the creek bragged. She dried apples in rings that turned the kitchen into a room where sweetness hung in plain sight. On a cold morning, sharp enough to make lungs blink, he brought her a sapling. Apple, sturdy, roots damp and ready. They dug together on the south-facing patch below the porch. "Trees are vows," she said, patting soil in tight around the trunk. "You promise what you can't yet taste." He set a stake and tied a soft tether. "And you keep promising while it weathers," he answered. The line not clever, just correct. They planted a second, and a third, plum, pear, because plenty, shared, is policy. Often after clinic hours, people climb the path not with illness but with news. A harvest saved, a fence mended, a baby due when the thaw comes. They stood in the doorway, the threshold that had once been a battleground between storm and shelter, and felt welcome turned from event into habit. Celeste never hurried them. She remembered how absence had once lived in her house like a third presence. The door stayed oiled. Winter returned, as it is its nature. Snow wrote white sentences across the ridge. The cabin roof crackled in night frost.
One evening, Wind went looking for old seams and found most of them already patched. Celeste and Jessie stood, shoulder to shoulder, in the open door and let the cold kiss their cheeks. He murmured what he had promised in spring, a vow that wore well. Storm or summer? She leaned into him, not for balance, but in agreement. Storm and summer. Some nights they kept no lamp, letting the fire light the room in moving orange. They spoke in the voices married people use when the world's volume can come down at last. About the clinic's ledgers, yes, but also about a girl who had pronounced Mercury like a spell and laughed when the word rolled right. About a boy who had learned to say, "I hurt," before the hurt turned to anger. They spoke, too, of Minerva, whom they would never meet, and gave thanks aloud so that gratitude could hear itself and stay. When loneliness, well practiced, came to test the latch it had once jiggled open with ease, it found it changed. Inside lived a woman who had kept herself intact through a long winter of neglect, and named her own worth without a chorus, and a man who had learned that staying is a craft and a daily choosing. The door, which had once been a question, had become an answer, and the life that opened from it walked forward, not fancy, not fragile, as durable and tender as bread set to rise and given the time it needs.